We are back on Morning Line. Nick Barris here on a Thursday. Our guest is Dahron Johnson. She is a transgender athlete, community activist here, talking about the whole question of transgender athletes competing, whether or not it's a level playing field or the like. Stacy just a moment ago asked several good questions. I thought, well, what about the idea? We don't know. Maybe you can go to how many transgender athletes are there out there, transgender perhaps women, and are there enough to start a league, or is the whole idea you don't want to have to start a separate league, you want to be included in what's being played?
The numbers are small. We saw this, I think, an example that really stood out in a lot of people's minds earlier this year is when I believe it was the Utah State Legislature passed a trans female ban on sports participation for middle and high schools, I think. And the governor vetoed that ban that the state legislature has passed, and in the process talked about how out of the 79,000 or so student athletes that legislation might have an impact on, four,
Right.
And that's trans female and trans men, our trans youth, really more broadly, and so there really aren't those numbers on a day-to-day basis to create the fields. As I was saying, right, participation numbers in cycling, for example, is we can combine 4 or 5 different sort of competitive experience and ability levels in cycling, and in a local race that might be a dozen folks who show up on the line, and that's
yeah. It's fair to say then, Dahron, I guess we're talking transgender athletes here, and you're right, it's a small portion, but there are some far more transgender people out there. I mean, millions probably, okay? And that goes to the larger question of when these types of limitations are placed, how does that affect the larger picture on individuals who are transgender, may not even be into athletics, but they see this happening and how it may make them feel about where they stand in society?
Yeah, exactly. That is by far the most important point of this whole conversation. The U.S. Women's soccer star Megan Rapinoe came out with a statement just earlier this week, really calling into question the type of restrictions that FINA, the swimming organization, and some of these other sports organizations have recently put in place, and saying the number of people that this would affect at its broadest is absolutely minuscule. The number of folks that it affects at competitive levels is even smaller. And when you're talking at international competition levels, it is 1 out of every 50,000, or so. It's a very small number. And her point was that number is so small that the thing that we really ought to be paying attention to is the message, the impact that this sends to folks who will never see that international swimming pool, will never see that international competition. But the type of message it sends for a young 12-year-old person who just wants to be able to feel at home in their own body. And sports can do that. This is one of the reasons that we encourage our children to participate in sports from such an early age, is to help them enjoy their body, to find out what the limits of this body can do. And Megan Rapinoe's point is that we really, given the minuscule number of athletes that this will impact at the absolute highest level, the far greater concern needs to be how this sends such a negative, minimizing image to the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of folks just trying to feel at home in themselves and in this world around us. And if you look at the messages that are coming out from a variety of places about the value of a life like mine, restrictions on books in libraries, restrictions on what teachers can teach in classrooms, adding then yet another place where our stories and our very presence is limited and problematized is a really dangerous message, and one I think that we have to be absolutely concerned about.
Okay, I just wanted to make that point without getting too far from the transgender athlete issue, but you're right. That is the larger picture here that people need to understand. So what would you say then to some parents who perhaps have a daughter, okay, who is competing in the local high school here, be it in soccer or maybe an individual sport, swimming, okay, and they're saying to themselves, look, there's this transgender athlete that's going to be competing against my daughter, and I don't think it is fair because, well, just look at them. This transgender athlete, she looks so much bigger, and they're going to be in the pool together, and it's not fair to my daughter who's trained and is going to compete, and all of a sudden, in the minds of these parents, my daughter all of a sudden is competing in the pool against a boy. That's what they're going to think. How would you get them to understand or maybe, accept that?
Well, First, I would say that there's a lesson and a powerful positive lesson to be gained from the example of somebody who is willing to kind of risk it all to say something to their parents. Can you imagine what it takes to have the courage to come out to anyone, but especially those closest to you, and then from there stepping into a more public space like a competitive a field or a pool or a court, the courage that it takes. So as a parent, I think one of the things that I would try to lift up is the example of the courageousness that takes. Then the second thing is on the physical differences. I would say that we really need to be careful about what is leading our own personal narratives and our own personal concerns. For example, in the legislature this year, there is testimony any number of times from women who had competed in, other women who had competed in high school and at college level, middle school level, about what it was like to compete against a boy. Well, that's not what we're talking about here. And so if we're talking about a teenager who's been courageous enough to come out to their family, if they are then in conversation with their parents and their medical providers and are going through this process and are living the life of the person that they are.
And they just want to compete in sports. Right. I'm glad you said that, because I know there are some people out there that think, well, these transgender athletes, they're just figuring, well, I can go compete in sports now because deep down I've got this testosterone. I can easily win and clean up. Seriously.
Yeah,
and I know that's absurd to me. To me, that's absurd. But I guarantee you there's people that think, oh, okay, well, this transgender athlete, they don't want to compete with men anymore. They're going to get in the pool with a woman where they can win.
And
it's out there. It's out there.
Yeah. Oh, I absolutely agree. I would say that in between work and mom life and everything else, I've still tried to do all that I can to be a competitive athlete. I push myself hard in my training, 8 to 12 hours a week on the bike, and I'm still losing, right? I mean, that doesn't necessitate an immediate advantage. But what I love is the performance aspect of sport. What can I find out about what this body can do? And I think if we focused on how we as individuals can learn how to engage in team dynamics, how to cooperate and move towards a common goal with others, if we can raise that up as one of the key values of sports, if we can look at this is what my body can perform on this given day as a sort of top-tier goal of sports participation and why we encourage our youth to participate in sports, then the how I did against someone else, it's still sports, right? There are winners and losers in the column, but that becomes secondary in a way to the sort of enriching aspects that we're trying to encourage in youth sports participation, and also in the type of participation I have, right? I'm not out there trying to win $1 million, right? I'm trying to create community. I'm trying to create connection. I'm trying to find the limits of my body and what it can do in these athletic endeavors. But the last thing in the world I'm really trying to do is go out there and win at all costs. The people who are doing that, we have measures in place. You know, the folks who are taking sort of every conceivable way to come out on top, right? That's what rules are already in place for. I'm out there in fields wanting to make sure that it's just as fair for me as it is for everybody else. I don't want it to be a lopsided competition. I want to be able to enjoy the competition itself. And so if I was out there dominating, well, I might look like Katie Ledecky in her recent competition world record performance, 13 seconds, 14 seconds ahead of the next nearest competitor. And that's with all cis females in the pool on that day. I might, if the competition was that unbalanced, I might be sitting there like Katie Ledecky was, just wondering what to do next.
Exactly. And your point's very well taken. And to even think that someone would go through everything it takes to come out and do something like this just so they have an advantage to win is absurd. Okay, it just is absurd. We'll take a break. We'll be back with our final comments with our guest right after this. Stay with us.